So we've got a little bit of a problem in our hands right now. I got rid of the Canon RP after using it for about a year or so. I'll talk more about it in a second, but that also means I don't have an RP to, you know, do some B-rolls on. So for the camera that you're gonna see in the next minute or so, which is the Canon R8, let's just pretend it's the Canon RP, okay? Because the body is pretty much the same anyways, almost. So a little backstory about my history with this camera. I got this camera back in 2022, and at that time it was my first full frame digital camera. I've done tons of work with this camera and it's always held up, and I can safely say that I probably wouldn't have upgraded this camera if it weren't for a couple of like personal preference in the way I like to shoot a camera. Till this day, I still love the images coming out from it, though I have seen some significant improvements after upgrading to the R6. So I don't usually start these camera videos by talking about their prices. However, this is probably the biggest selling point of this camera. It's just a ridiculous price for a camera that offers really not that much compromise in many departments. It's gonna still take decent video, decent photos, not great, but the price, that is what makes a big difference on this. So now if we got the price out of the way, what do you actually get with the Canon RP? You get a 26.2 full frame CMOS sensor that's probably the same as the 6D Mark II. Some would like that, some wouldn't. It has a max birth rate of up to 4 frames per second with an asterisk. It's got no IBIS, it has no mechanical shutter, it only has the first curtain electronic shutter. It runs on a Digic 8 processor, which is a little bit of a dated processor, I guess, but the camera did come out a while ago. And it also shoots up to 4K video with an asterisk. Now, one of the few things that attracted me to this camera at that time was the fact that it had a full frame sensor in a really small and lightweight body. So this camera is so small, and I've got smaller hands compared to a lot of people, so like a lot of people are complaining about their pinky hanging out from a camera, but I've never had that issue. Other than that, the dials and buttons, they feel kind of nice. I like how they don't feel particularly cheap even from a camera this price. They obviously don't feel as good as the R6 or the EOS R even. I also like the fact that the shutter button is the not clicked one, which tends to be the norm for the more pro line of cameras, so I'm glad they have it with this camera as well. And lastly, the fact that it is weather sealed is a big bonus, because sometimes you're just caught in the rain and like you can't do anything about it. And thankfully, this camera does have that weather sealing protection, though some people do say that it's not as weather sealed as certain other cameras. I have not seen this written anywhere. I could not find it, and if anyone can find it, let me know, or just keep it to yourself, whatever. But a lot of people claim this, but I've not seen proof of it. Like, I've never seen any mention of it by Canon or anything. And I should know, because I've used this camera in like torrential rain before, and it came out like a champ. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever, and if something did go wrong, it's already sold. So I don't really like the fact that you only have a top dial and a thumb dial here. You're lacking a thumb wheel. I prefer to have 3 different dials for the 3 settings that I use for exposure, namely the shutter speed, the aperture, as well as the ISO for the thumb wheel. That's how I usually like to set my camera up. I know you have the option of using the control ring for that as well, or you can just use the touch screen, or you know, map another button to get into that function. I just don't really like that. That's not my preference of shooting. I also prefer to have it match with my M6 Mark II, and that camera has 3 dials, and I like to learn something once and not like think about it every single time I want to take a photo. So that was a pretty big deal breaker for me, but if it's nothing to you, I'm sure you will have no problem with it. Sort of all the Canon cameras that I've used in the RF mount, namely like the R5, the R6, the EOS R, the RP, the R6 Mark II, R7, R8, out of all those cameras, I genuinely have not found a camera that had a better looking color science than the RP, in my opinion. I know a lot of you are going to disagree with me, but for me, The starting point on the facial profile, like straight out of camera on the RP, that color science, I absolutely love that. And having a starting point that looks good to you is really important, especially for me, and only if I'm doing like some event shoots or like client shoots that need to keep the looks close to, you know, what it was on the day kind of thing. I would prefer to have it look pretty similar but also be, you know, nice. The dynamic range on this camera, however, seems to be a lot of people's complaint, probably because it's performing poorly compared to cameras that were out at the time, especially from the competition. After using it for a couple of years, I don't know, I kind of thought it was fine. I never felt that it was lacking too much. I would obviously always welcome more, but at that time, because I think I was doing mostly photography work as well, raw files are much easier to manipulate than like the you know, 8-bit files that you're getting from video. Now, however, after moving on to the Canon R6, I can say that that's a pretty significant bump in terms of like dynamic range. So I guess if I go back to the RP now, I might not feel the same way about it that I did. But saying that, I use the M6 Mark II, which I believe has slightly lower dynamic range than the RP. Could correct me if I'm wrong. And I don't have a problem with that. So in photography, I think it's gonna be okay. One thing I do have a complaint about though is the digital sharpening that seems to be going on in the video side of things with this camera, which is also probably the same thing that you get with a lot of the lower end models from Canon. Supporting Canon's dual pixel autofocus means you're probably gonna be fine when you're shooting slow to mid-paced events, as well as, you know, portrait work or some landscape stuff, which you probably won't even want to use like autofocus anyways, or even, you know, street photography. Though you might have some trouble if you're trying to shoot some wildlife or even some sports photography. Having spent most of my time with this camera doing work that mainly revolves around portrait photography, I can report a non-scientifically proven guesstimate of about a 99.37% hit rate for the autofocus. So remember I told you about how this camera shoots 4K and that it has an asterisk next to it? Let's get back to the asterisk. So the thing about that 4K is, firstly, we just talked about autofocus and how good this dual pixel autofocus tech is. Well, when you shoot in 4K, you lose that capability and you're downgraded down to the contrast detect autofocus. Basically means you probably will never be in focus ever. And I'm not even exaggerating, because once it gets your face, it just hunts again, because I have no idea. Next thing is probably not such a big deal, but there is an APS-C size crop on this sensor when you shoot in 4K, so it would make your wider lenses a little bit more tighter and your tighter lenses even tighter. So yeah, if you don't want to work with that, then that 4K is not going to work for you. However, the final big thing that I have about this 4K is the fact that, like, I've never seen a camera shoot with this kind of a rolling shutter since 1995. Like, if you're using anything higher than a 24mm lens on this camera and you shoot in 4K, you're gonna see only squiggly lines. And I wish I was exaggerating. I thought I could use the 4K as like a tool to get a little bit of an extra reach and then crop in a little bit more. I thought it was a cool thing to try to do, but all I got was just jellos and jellos and jellos. And I don't usually complain about rolling shutter, but this is different. This is not rolling shutter. This is, I don't know, this is the king of rolling shutters. So while I talk big about this camera and how much I love it, why don't I just show you a couple of sample images on the way as well. And you can listen to my beautiful voice just narrate over this collection of photos. Is my voice distracting when you're watching these photos? Do you like this photo that I've taken? I don't know what photo you're looking at. I will only add them in post. So I'll probably get a really nice photo on that. Well, this one's a nice one. Again, I don't know what photo's on the screen, but yeah. Oh, this one, I don't know if I really like that one anymore. Yeah. This wasn't even taken on this camera, but I like it anyway, so I just decided to put it in there for a second. So here's the big question, right? Since I love this camera so much, like, why did I get rid of it? The first thing I didn't like about this camera is the fact that it has such a crazy limitation on 4K, and it's not what you think. I actually didn't even intend on shooting in 4K. I thought I was going to use it as a tool. Half the time I was still going to shoot in 1080p for most of my stuff, and most of the time I'm still shooting in 1080p. This is not in 1080p though, but like a lot of times I'm still shooting in 1080p. I have no problem with that. But this camera, if I put an APS-C lens on it, and I know you're going to be like, yeah, you have a full frame sensor, why are you using an APS-C lens? Sometimes I want to do that. So I don't really care about making full use of the lens every single time, because I think it always has to come to practicalities. So when I come to a point when I do need to use the APS-C lens on this, it will not allow me to use an APS-C lens on this camera without shooting in 4K. So that means if I use an APS-C lens on this camera, I am going to be forced to shoot a bigger file size with horrible rolling shutter with essentially no autofocus. And that to me was appalling, because right now if I do that on the R6, it's going to allow me full capabilities with the crop. So yeah, that didn't really sit well with me. Another thing I didn't like about this camera, we did speak about this earlier, is the fact that the dials have one missing thumb wheel. I wish they had that thumb wheel there. That was quite a big deal breaker for me, just because my M6 Mark II has it, and I do prefer using two cameras that function the same way and have the same kind of like, you know, tendencies of like functions. Now the other issue is the fact that these dials are not really fully customizable. Like you can't you have limitations onto certain things that you can map onto these dials and buttons. I know Sony cameras, they kind of just allow you to do whatever you want with every button and dial. I wish Canon would do the same thing. However, Canon seems to think that they know like the best for you for every situation, which I don't know. I don't like that. The third one's a little bit weird, because I did mention how I like the smaller size cameras and all, but I think for like the main camera body, I've grown to be a little bit more accustomed to the bigger body size. So the R6 that I got, I like that size, and in fact after a while I kind of liked it a little bit bigger, so I just got a cage for it as well, so that I could hold it and it felt a little bit more substantial like as a grip. So I don't know, I'm moving towards that slightly bigger body when it comes to like the main camera that I use right now. And last but not least, I don't like the fact that it doesn't shoot C-Log 3. I know that like C-Log 3 is not really the best log profile in the world, but at the same time I would prefer to have that log profile, just because, you know, when I need to use it, it's there, and that was my preference. Finally, my thoughts about this camera is that I think it's a really good camera for a lot of people. It just isn't one for me to keep as my main camera. But considering its price and its abilities, it's going to be great for a lot of people, especially if you get it used. It's still a great performer at the end of the day, and the images that come of it, like I mentioned, it's still beautiful. So it will serve you as a great camera as long as you feed it great things. You point the cameras at the right stuff, it's gonna shoot out really beautiful looking stuff. Comment if you once had an RP like me and decided to get rid of it, and tell me why you still miss your RP, or tell me that I can't think of anything. Anyways, like the video if you want to like it, and subscribe if you want to. Okay, bye.